What if the most renowned sermon ever preached was also the most profoundly misunderstood? Millions across generations have heard its words, quoted its timeless phrases, and adorned their walls with uplifting excerpts. They have committed to memory the powerful injunctions about turning the other cheek, the poetic imagery of the lilies of the field, and the promise of the meek inheriting the earth. And yet, for all this familiarity, many have inadvertently overlooked the radical implications of what Jesus was truly accomplishing that day, high on a hillside in Galilee. A diverse crowd had gathered, and it was far from the assembly one might expect. Yes, the devout were certainly present, but so too were the truly desperate. Parents tormented by sleepless nights, agonizing over children they could not adequately feed, fishermen precariously close to ruin, just one poor season away from losing their entire livelihood, young men whose hands perpetually itched for a sword, yearning to strike back against Roman oppression, and those who had long ago abandoned the rigid religious establishment, unaware that a deep spiritual hunger for God still stirred within them. Into the midst of this complex and burdened multitude, a carpenter simply sat down. What he delivered next transcended the conventional sermon. It was a transformative teaching that fundamentally reshaped how people perceived blessing, justice, prayer, and forgiveness, a reorientation that continues to resonate powerfully even to this present day. Yet, one of the most crucial elements of this sermon lies not solely in what Jesus articulated, but profoundly in the deliberate sequence in which he presented his teachings. Let us delve deeper to uncover what Jesus truly intended that day, examining his message line by line, much as that initial crowd on the hillside heard it, and why the expansive kingdom of God often reveals itself precisely where we would least expect to discover it. The people who assembled on that Galilean hillside did not arrive with minds blank or spirits empty. They carried with them a lifetime of internal voices, loud, confident pronouncements that had painstakingly defined what a blessed life should look like, what God truly desired, and how the world actually operated. Among these ingrained perspectives were those of the Pharisees, the meticulous guardians of the law, distinguished men in their fine robes. They meticulously quantified righteousness, measuring it in precise inches and centimeters. The exact distance one walked on the Sabbath, the elaborate care with which one washed their hands, or the conspicuousness of one's fasting. For them, religion was primarily a performance, and holiness was a carefully delineated boundary. To ascertain God's favor, one merely needed to consult their exhaustive list and diligently check the boxes. Tragically, many in that very crowd on the hillside had spent their entire lives falling short of these stringent checklists, leaving them burdened by a pervasive sense that God was perpetually disappointed in them. Then there were the zealots, the passionate radicals, who met in hushed backrooms to secretly sharpen their blades. Their gospel was starkly simple. They had grown weary of prayer and piety. They believed the kingdom would manifest not through divine intervention, but through fire, through violent revolt, through Roman bloodshed in the very streets of Jerusalem. They had grown utterly exhausted waiting for God to act, so they had resolved to act decisively on his behalf. And finally, there was Rome itself, the omnipresent empire that controlled the roads, levied the temple tax, and stationed its soldiers on every street corner. Rome, too, proclaimed its own gospel, an ancient creed echoing through the ages. Power is the sole truth, strength the only virtue. The strong prevail and consume, while the weak merely serve. The only enduring kingdom is the one ruthlessly established and maintained at the sharp point of a spear. Three distinct voices, three fundamentally divergent visions of what a truly blessed life might entail. And if one listens with discerning ears, the echoes of all three can still be heard reverberating in our world today. The spirit of the Pharisee persists in every culture of religious exhibitionism, where outward perception of one's faith sadly overshadows the genuine internal transformation it is meant to cultivate. The zealot's ideology lives on in every movement, convinced that God's divine purposes can only be achieved through coercive force, through unbridled anger, or by aggressively tearing down those deemed wrong. And Rome remains, perhaps, the loudest voice of all. Its relentless mantra still exhorts us: acquire more, ascend higher, always win. The powerful will feast. These were the insistent voices ringing in the ears of the crowd on that hillside. And then, the carpenter quietly sat down. In the rabbinic tradition, a teacher would typically stand to read the sacred scriptures, but sit down to deliver an authoritative teaching. When Jesus deliberately took his seat, the crowd instinctively recognized that he was about to speak with profound authority. His words would be heard, meticulously remembered, and implicitly obeyed. He surveyed the faces before him, the desperate, the furious, the utterly exhausted, and allowed a profound silence to do its powerful work. Then he finally opened his mouth and uttered, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The very first words from his lips were a blessing, pronounced over people whom the world had long taught to perceive themselves as utterly forgotten and insignificant. Many people approach the Beatitudes as if they were a spiritual buffet, 8 distinct blessings, each for a different category of person. One might simply select the blessing that conveniently fits their personal situation and leave the rest for others. However, if one reads them consecutively and slowly, they begin to cohere into something far grander. They cease to sound like 8 isolated statements about 8 disparate types of individuals, and instead coalesce into a singular, unified portrait, one distinct face, one particular kind of life, meticulously traced from the innermost being outward. When contemplated together, the Beatitudes reveal to us the very contours of a person being transformed and shaped by the kingdom of God. Jesus extended an open invitation to the entire crowd to step into this extraordinary life. And he began precisely where every authentic life with God must invariably commence. Poor in spirit is often easily misinterpreted. It might sound like self-deprecation, like constantly announcing one's brokenness to the world. However, Jesus was pointing to something infinitely deeper: the radical, unflinching honesty of a person who has at long last ceased all pretense before God. It means letting go of the desperate need to appear as though you have everything perfectly together. You shed the performance, the carefully constructed image of your own spirituality. What remains, unveiled and true, is the profound realization that you are utterly incapable of saving yourself, that you are, in fact, utterly dependent on Him. This profound honesty serves as the very doorway through which every other truth and teaching in the sermon subsequently flows. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. This transcends mere grief over personal loss. It is a discerning grief, a deep sorrow that sees with unclouded vision, a mourning over the devastating impact of sin on oneself, on the precious people one loves, and on the fractured world itself. The individual who mourns in this transformative way is truly wide awake. They have ceased numbing themselves to the pervasive wrongness of things, and they are courageously willing to fully feel its weight. And Jesus declares that these are precisely the ones whom God will personally comfort. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Meekness is frequently, and mistakenly, equated with weakness, but it is, in fact, its profound opposite. Meekness embodies strength that has been willingly surrendered to God's authority. Imagine a magnificent warhorse that has undergone rigorous training, immense power held under absolute, disciplined control, strength that remains utterly still until it is precisely directed. Consider a seasoned soldier whose hand never instinctively reaches for his sword unless his commander explicitly gives the order. That is the essence of meekness. Truly, the strongest person in any room is the one who harbors no internal need whatsoever to prove it. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Most interpretations of the Beatitudes tend to remain superficial at this juncture. In the biblical context, righteousness encompasses far more than mere personal holiness. It also profoundly signifies justice, the active process of setting right what has gone wrong in the world. When Jesus speaks of hungering for righteousness, he means something deeper than simply desiring to be a good person. He is referring to individuals who ache with a profound longing for the world itself to be made just, who cannot tolerate the vast chasm between what is and what should be. And he pronounces them blessed. Their profound hunger is not a deficit, but a vibrant sign of spiritual life. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. From this point onward, the portrait painted by the Beatitudes begins to turn outward. The first 4 Beatitudes meticulously describe an inner posture, the very disposition of the soul before God. The subsequent 3, however, delineate what naturally flows outward from that transformed inner state. It is simply impossible to be genuinely poor in spirit and simultaneously remain unmerciful toward other people. You cannot authentically mourn what is deeply wrong in the world and yet tolerate division and strife within your own cherished relationships. The inside inevitably shapes the outside. Thus, the Beatitudes function less like a disconnected list and more like an interconnected chain, with each link powerfully drawing the next forward. And then comes the final one, the seal upon this profound portrait. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus concludes this portrait with unflinching honesty. If you truly choose to live this way, humble in spirit, genuinely mourning, profoundly meek, hungering deeply for justice, richly merciful, pure in heart, and courageously peacemaking, the world will, without question, push back against you. It will push back precisely because you are embodying an authentic truth in a world that has relentlessly organized itself around something entirely different. Persecution, he asserts, may well be the clearest evidence that you are, in fact, still on the right path. 8 powerful statements, forming one unified face. On that ancient hillside, Jesus meticulously painted a single, transformative kind of life, and then he extended a personal invitation for each person to step fully into it. The crowd was still absorbing the profound implications of the Beatitudes when Jesus looked upon them, the desperate, the weary, the seemingly unimportant, and spoke words they could scarcely believe were truly intended for them. You are the salt of the earth. Then he offered them a second evocative image. You are the light of the world. This was their identity already now. To this gathering of fishermen, farmers, and broken souls who had just been told they were blessed in their poverty of spirit, the Beatitudes illuminated who they were in the eyes of God. Salt and light, however, unveiled what they were now called to do. Jesus was masterfully transforming blessing into purposeful action. In the ancient world, salt's utility extended far beyond merely seasoning food. One of its most indispensable functions was preservation. In a time utterly devoid of refrigeration, salt was the crucial barrier that stood between a fish caught at sunrise and decaying meat by sunset. Salt preserved. It steadfastly held back the insidious decay that was always quietly, relentlessly taking over. So, when Jesus designated his followers as the salt of the earth, his image carried multiple layers of meaning, with preservation being one of the most incisive. Is your very presence preserving anything? Does your home environment exhibit more patience simply because you are there? Are your children learning the profound lesson of mercy because they have observed you practicing it, even when you were utterly exhausted? Is there a space at work where destructive gossip simply withers and dies because you steadfastly refuse to participate in or feed it? Is there a precious friendship that has not deteriorated into bitterness because you courageously chose to forgive even before an apology was offered? That is the potent work of salt. It does not loudly announce its presence. It simply enters into what would otherwise decay and quietly, yet powerfully, holds back that corruption. And that, fundamentally, is one of the profound questions salt poses before every follower of Jesus. Is anything around you less corrupted, less deteriorated, simply because you are present within it? Then he shifted his focus to light. And of all the magnificent images of light he could have chosen, he deliberately reached for the humblest one, a lamp, a small, steady, household flame, the kind of light you place on a stand in a single room so that those inside can navigate without stumbling over the furniture. Jesus was asking for a quiet steadiness, a presence so consistently reliable that the people around you could genuinely find their way by it. He then pushed this metaphor one crucial step further. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. He directly named the temptation because, indeed, the temptation is profoundly real. Most of us, when we perceive the potential cost of being visible, of standing out, instinctively reach for that metaphorical bowl to conceal our light. We fall silent when our conscience is urgently prompting us to speak. We laugh along with the crowd when something deep within us knows unequivocally better. We carefully keep our deeply held convictions off the table because we are fearful of making the room uncomfortable. We often deceive ourselves, rationalizing that we are being wise, when sometimes it is simply fear cleverly wearing a more respectable name. Jesus recognized this pervasive human tendency, and he addressed it with one of the simplest, yet most profound, commands in the entire sermon. Let your light shine. Not so that people will gaze admiringly at you, but rather so that they will look up, so that they will witness your good works, and, in doing so, give glory to your Father in heaven. The order of these teachings truly matters. Before Jesus began to instruct his followers on the intricate details of how to live, before the lengthy passages concerning anger, lust, prayer, worry, and judgment, he paused and first declared what they already were: salt, light. This truth was already inherent in them. Their only task was to live in accordance with that profound reality. And now, having named their essential identity, he was finally prepared to reveal what that kind of transformed life would genuinely look like when it courageously stepped out into the complexities of the real world. Immediately following his teachings on salt and light, Jesus turned his attention to the law itself. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. One could almost feel the crowd stiffen with apprehension. These individuals had lived their entire lives under the encompassing weight of the law. For some, it had been a source of comfort and structure. For others, it had become a burden so overwhelmingly heavy that they had long since ceased trying to meet its demands. And here stood this carpenter from Nazareth, devoid of rabbinic credentials, possessing no recognized standing in the temple establishment, boldly declaring what he had come to do with the most sacred inheritance of their entire nation. To fulfill means to bring something to its full, intended meaning, to complete what had always been pointing forward. He had come to guide the law to the ultimate destination it had been reaching toward all along, and in doing so, to unveil its true, deeper purpose. Again and again, he employed a unique formula that no other teacher had ever dared to use. You have heard that it was said, but I tell you. He took ancient commands that the crowd had heard since childhood and meticulously pulled back their superficial layers to reveal the profound spiritual truth embedded beneath. He began with the commandment against murder. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. The crowd likely did not flinch at the first half of the statement. Most of them had, thankfully, never killed anyone. They had successfully remained on the right side of that commandment throughout their lives. But then Jesus deliberately stepped past the physical act of murder entirely and incisively placed his finger on the very soil where murder actually originates and grows. Anger that has festered and hardened into contempt. The quiet, insidious decision made somewhere deep within that another human being is fundamentally worthless. Jesus was not merely reinterpreting the commandment. He was making it profoundly more honest, reaching beyond the outward act to expose the very root of the destructive impulse that produces it. For anyone who has ever truly harbored hatred for another person knows precisely where that perilous road ultimately leads if it is not halted in its earliest stages. From there, he turned to the issue of adultery. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Desire, in itself, is an inherent part of the human experience. What Jesus was targeting here was something altogether different. The gaze you choose to hold on to, the fantasy you deliberately keep feeding, the conscious decision to continually return to something you already know is slowly, insidiously breaking you from the inside out. He was profoundly protecting his listeners from themselves, and in doing so, he was also protecting the innocent people they might one day have harmed by allowing that internal damage to spread and manifest externally. Then, he approached what many consider the most challenging of his statements. You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. For 2 millennia, people have misinterpreted this as a passive command to become a doormat, to simply absorb abuse without any form of protest. But such an interpretation fundamentally misunderstands Jesus' deeper intention. In its first-century context, a strike to the right cheek most often indicated a backhand. The way a powerful individual would strike someone they considered beneath them, a blow deliberately designed to shame and demean, not primarily to engage in a physical fight. To turn the other cheek, in such a scenario, was an act of profound courage. It was to look the aggressor directly in the face and silently, yet powerfully, force him to make a choice. He would either have to humiliate you in the exact same manner again, which the new angle of your turned face would no longer physically allow, or he would be compelled to strike you as one equal would strike another, an act that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic and his own perceived status. Therefore, turning the other cheek was an act of quiet, dignified defiance, a resolute refusal to play the oppressive game on the aggressor's demeaning terms. The same profound logic underpins the teaching of going the second mile, or willingly giving one's cloak as well as their shirt. Each of these examples illustrates a proactive way of breaking the destructive cycle of retaliation without ever becoming passively subservient or utterly helpless in the face of injustice. Then, Jesus took that same radical refusal to strike back and pushed it to its absolute furthest edge. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In an occupied land, this command utterly contradicted every deeply ingrained emotion and instinct they harbored. The people listening to Jesus walked past Roman soldiers every single day. Some had tragically buried family members who had fallen under Roman swords. To them, hating the enemy felt like an act of profound loyalty, even a sacred expression of justice. And yet, Jesus looked directly at that festering hatred and astonishingly asked them to pray for the very people who held the spears that oppressed them. His underlying reason for this went far deeper than mere kindness. Hatred, if carried unchecked, slowly but inevitably reshapes whoever harbors it, until the individual fighting the oppressor gradually begins to mirror the very characteristics of the one he despises. Praying for an enemy is the transformative way in which you prevent your own soul from hardening into the destructive thing you claim to abhor. Finally, Jesus brought this powerful sequence of reinterpreting the law to a close with a seemingly daunting statement. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That particular line has disquieted and confused readers for 2 millennia, primarily because they frequently mishear one crucial word. Perfect here does not merely denote the absence of flaws or moral blamelessness. It points to something far more profound: maturity, completeness, wholeness, and love. The verses immediately preceding this statement beautifully illuminate what he meant. God sends his rain equally upon the righteous and the unrighteous. He extends his love even to those who curse him. That is the profound completeness Jesus was speaking of. He was asking them to love in the same all-encompassing, genuine, and unconditional way their Father loves, a love poured out generously, even upon those who revile him. By this juncture in the sermon, One can vividly imagine the crowd beginning to feel the immense weight and transformative power of what Jesus was meticulously constructing. He had fundamentally reframed their very identity before God and clearly articulated their divine purpose in the world. He had shown them, with irrefutable clarity, that the law had always reached far beyond mere outward actions to penetrate the deepest recesses of the human heart. And now, he turned a significant corner, leading them into an even more uncomfortable and intimate realm, the secret places of devotion. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. This single sentence acts as the governing principle for everything in this subsequent part of the sermon, because Jesus was about to do something his listeners undoubtedly did not expect. He did not abolish the spiritual practices themselves. Giving, prayer, and fasting were the three venerable pillars of devotion in first-century Jewish life, and he unequivocally affirmed all three. What he surgically targeted was something far more subtle, a danger that even the most devout people in the crowd had likely never been warned about. The insidious peril of using spiritual practices as a means to construct or bolster one's own ego. The danger of helping someone and then subtly, even subconsciously, waiting for them to notice and commend you. The danger of praying in a way that sounds impressively holy in public but falls silent the very moment the door closes behind you. And the danger of fasting with a heavy, somber face, subtly hoping someone will inquire about your sacrifice. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. He was describing a person who has simply ceased keeping any internal score of their good deeds. Someone whose generosity flows so naturally, so quietly, and so selflessly that they never return home at night and add it to a private, mental list of all the good they have accomplished. Then he turned to the practice of prayer and gave them a prayer that humanity has continued to utter ever since. Our Father in heaven. 2 simple words. And already, the entire posture of prayer had profoundly shifted. He could have instructed them to address God as a majestic king or a stern judge. Instead, the word he placed on their lips was Father, invoking the intimacy of family. You approach God as a cherished child comes home, already belonging, with absolutely nothing left to prove. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. The prayer begins with an acknowledgement of God's holy name, God's sovereign kingdom, and God's perfect will, all before a single one of our own personal needs is even uttered. Surrender precedes supplication. The heart is reoriented toward God's priorities before any specific requests begin. Most of us, sadly, tend to pray the Lord's Prayer backward. We start with our own needs and perhaps try to remember God somewhere near the end. Jesus, however, reveals the opposite, more transformative movement. Give us today our daily bread. Just for today. Enough sustenance for the day immediately before you, with nothing hoarded or held back for tomorrow. It is a daily dependence, chosen intentionally and embraced with purpose, rather than begrudgingly admitted under duress. And then comes a line that Jesus steadfastly refused to leave ambiguous. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. In the verses immediately following the Lord's Prayer, Jesus pauses everything else and circles back to this single petition, emphasizing it alone, to ensure with absolute certainty that the crowd did not miss its profound significance. Because unforgiveness extends its damaging reach far beyond your individual relationships. It effectively closes the very channel through which you are meant to receive what you most desperately need from God. The hand that stubbornly refuses to release someone else's debt cannot simultaneously open to receive the boundless mercy God is actively trying to pour into it. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. This serves as a vital reminder as the prayer concludes. You are living in a spiritual battle you cannot always perceive. You are not imagining it, and crucially, you are not fighting alone. Next, Jesus turned his attention to fasting and maintained the same underlying theme. Do not look the part. Do not wear your hunger conspicuously on your face for others to observe. Fasting, as taught by Jesus, is the spiritual practice of consciously training the body that it is not, ultimately, in charge. It is the physical manifestation of "your will be done," the deliberate moment you declare to your appetites, "You do not get to decide today." And beneath all three of these foundational practices, giving, praying, and fasting, Jesus was making one quiet, yet potent, point. The spiritual disciplines he offers us are not performative acts designed to win human applause. They are sacred, hidden places where the heart privately returns to the Father who sees in secret. For much of the sermon's interpretive history, readers have tended to treat what comes next as two distinct teachings: the passage on treasure, followed by the passage on worry. Two seemingly different problems, two distinct mini-sermons contained within the same chapter. However, Jesus perceived a single, unifying problem underlying both. In the second half of Matthew chapter 6, this profound connection becomes crystal clear. He was diagnosing a solitary spiritual sickness and revealing its two distinct faces: accumulation and preoccupation, treasure and worry. Both are essentially the same underlying fear wearing two different masks. The pervasive fear that God may not truly be enough, leading to the desperate conviction that I had better manage things myself. Jesus begins with the concept of treasure. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Jesus had something far more piercing in mind than merely warning about the inherent dangers of wealth. He was directly telling the crowd what their chosen treasure would ultimately do to them. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Whatever you primarily lean on for a sense of safety and security, that is precisely where your heart will gradually migrate to and take up permanent residence. Perhaps this resonates with you. Before your feet even touch the floor in the morning, the thought of money is already weighing heavily on your mind, even before you have uttered a single prayer. The overdue bill, the dwindling balance in the account, the constant mental math of how to make it last until the end of the month. These thoughts silently consume you. You harbor a quiet fear, a pervasive anxiety that has crept into your heart, seizing the very first moments of your day. Money wields this power when it's allowed to occupy the wrong position in your life, working subtly, settling into the core of your being from the inside out, often before you even realize what's happening. Then, Jesus articulated the stark choice that lay beneath this struggle. No one can serve two masters, for either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. He was not exaggerating this truth. A human heart simply cannot give its allegiance to two masters simultaneously. Sooner or later, one will inevitably take control and begin to dictate your understanding of everything in life. The critical question Jesus pressed upon both the crowd and upon you is precisely this: which master is truly speaking to you? Which one influences your perception of whether your day was a good one? Which one dictates whether your life feels purposeful and on track? Which master determines if you can sleep peacefully tonight? That, in essence, is the master that truly possesses your heart. From this point, Jesus shifted his focus to the pervasive problem of worry. The diagnosis remained the same, but the symptom was different. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Imagine, somewhere in that crowd, stood a man with no idea where his next week's food would come from. A widow might have been there, carefully counting the meager provisions left in her jar. When Jesus uttered the words, "Do not worry about what you will eat," he was looking directly at people who had every conceivable reason to be deeply anxious. He spoke these words to their faces on a dusty hillside, even as their stomachs were likely empty. He never dismissed worry as foolish or implied that the circumstances prompting it were easy to bear. Instead, he pointed to the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. Their existence is far from effortless, Yet no bird carries the unique torment that human beings invent for themselves, a torment of endlessly rehearsing futures that have not yet arrived, grieving losses we have not suffered, and living entire days trapped within a tomorrow that may never materialize. The sparrow, by contrast, lives entirely within the abundant provision of the present moment, and that singular focus is the profound secret of its peace. Jesus was inviting his listeners into that same profound trust, a quiet confidence in a God who is already holding fast to the very things they are most terrified of losing. Then he steered them in a completely different direction. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. When the kingdom of God is prioritized above all else in your life, everything else slowly, gracefully, finds its rightful place. It happens gradually, naturally, much like a plant instinctively grows toward the light. The pursuit of earthly treasure ceases to be your master, and the suffocating grip of worry finally loosens. Because this was Jesus' underlying message all along. The true antidote to worry is not simply more willpower or stoicism. It is worship. It is the daily, deliberate act of reorienting your entire life around a God who is already holding the very thing you are most afraid of losing. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. This is probably the most frequently quoted line Jesus ever spoke, and regrettably, one of the most widely misunderstood. In our modern world, it often functions as a conversation stopper, a convenient way to silence any moral conviction someone else finds uncomfortable or simply doesn't want to hear. It's as if Jesus had spent his time wandering through Galilee proclaiming that nothing is inherently right or wrong, and that no one is permitted to notice anything about anyone else. But he intended something far sharper and more specific. To judge can signify two distinct actions: merely noticing what is wrong, or condemning the person who committed the wrong. And the context surrounding this verse unmistakably reveals which meaning Jesus had in mind. He was cautioning against issuing a definitive verdict, against passing a final sentence, and against presumptuously appointing yourself as the ultimate arbiter of another person's worth. He was, in essence, telling them to step out of a chair that was never theirs to occupy. They could still acknowledge truth and falsehood, good and evil. They simply had no right to hand down a final judgment. Then, he vividly illustrated how absurd they appeared when they attempted to do so anyway. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? We are all guilty of this. We easily catch the sharp edge in someone else's tone of voice, yet remain deaf to it in our own. We can meticulously recall what another person said 5 years ago, but somehow conveniently forget what we uttered just yesterday. You can almost feel the realization ripple through the crowd. The respectable man, who had come expecting Jesus to publicly identify the sinners around him, slowly began to understand that the teaching had pivoted, turning directly back toward him. The individual who had spent years fastidiously tallying a neighbor's faults now felt the profound weight of his own shortcomings settling upon him. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Most people stop reading after "do not judge," missing the entirely crucial second half. This is the part where Jesus actually instructs them on how to help, but in a very particular sequence. Your own plank first, then your brother's speck. The entire teaching hinges on that single, pivotal word, first. It demands self-examination before correction and humility before clarity. The person who has genuinely wrestled with their own substantial flaws is the only one who can be truly trusted to handle someone else's minor imperfection. They will approach it gently, with the careful touch one uses for something known to be fragile. They remember precisely how it feels to have something painfully pulled from an eye. So, they proceed slowly. They keep their voice soft and low. They simply offer help, recalling the way they themselves were once helped. That is the profound posture Jesus is teaching, and it is the very same posture that extends into every subsequent word he speaks. The inner stance that shapes how you respond to another person's failure is precisely the same one that will shape how you respond to their needs. Mercy is not merely an action. It is a fundamental way of being, and it reaches out in every direction simultaneously. So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. It has been called the golden rule for such a long time that most people no longer truly hear the radical essence of what it actually commands. There exists a quieter, more restrained version of this teaching that appears in nearly every culture, sometimes referred to as the silver rule. Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. On the surface, it sounds almost identical. Yet, it is something else entirely. The silver rule asks only for restraint, for non-interference. It says, do no harm. Stay out of the way. What Jesus offered, however, was its profound opposite. He said, do actively. Move toward someone. Anticipate what they might need even before they ask, and then go and meet that need. The silver rule allows you to comfortably sit on your hands, provided those hands are not actively hurting anyone. The golden rule, by its very nature, does not allow you to sit at all. And then he finished the sentence with immense gravity. For this sums up the law and the prophets. This one transformative sentence. Every command in the law concerning love for your neighbor, every urgent warning, every heartfelt plea, every call for justice and mercy passionately spoken by the prophets, all of it compressed into a single, comprehensive posture. Treat people exactly the way you would want them to treat you. The entire moral heart of the law and the prophets, encapsulated in a single breath. That is what Jesus profoundly claims here. And once you have truly heard it, you cannot unhear it. But Jesus did not allow the crowd to linger long in the comforting warmth of that single sentence. He understood something fundamental about his listeners, and indeed, about every listener who would come after them. The very moment people encounter a beautiful teaching, the powerful temptation is to simply admire its elegance and then walk away, utterly unchanged. So he immediately drew them a clear map, 2 gates, 2 roads, 2 distinct destinations. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Jesus leaves absolutely no room for a neutral or middle path. He speaks of 2 roads with 2 vastly different destinations, one leading to ultimate life with God, the other to destruction. The narrow gate points directly toward that ultimate, abundant life, but it also vividly describes the practical shape of discipleship here and now. The road leads to life precisely because it embodies the path Jesus has just meticulously described. The Beatitudes are narrow. So is the radical call to love your enemy. So is secret generosity, choosing trust instead of debilitating worry, and diligently pulling the plank from your own eye before you even consider touching someone else's speck. Treating people the way you would want them to treat you, every single day, even, and especially, when they have not earned it, is the narrowest road of all. Most people instinctively find themselves on the wide road simply because it's where everyone else already is. It demands nothing of you that you don't already feel inclined to do. It feels utterly natural. It feels normal. And the narrow road, by its very nature, will always feel like a strenuous swim against the prevailing current. So, what does this narrow path actually look like in our daily lives? It looks like being the first one to lower your voice in the heat of an argument. It looks like being the first to send that message after days of tense silence. It means being the first to stop punishing someone with emotional distance. And sometimes, it simply looks like giving generously without first making sure the other person had somehow earned your kindness. The narrow gate is not waiting for the strongest, or the smartest, or the most outwardly religious, or even the most disciplined among us. It is waiting for the willing. It is waiting for those who heard everything Jesus uttered on that hillside and simply decided, yes, that is the life I want to build, whatever the cost, however few people walk it beside me. Everything in this profound sermon has been meticulously building toward this very moment. The Beatitudes, the call to be salt and light, the deeper heart behind the law, the hidden practices of giving, prayer, and fasting, the choice between treasure and worry, the plank and the speck, the golden rule, the narrow gate. all are interconnected. All along, Jesus had been laying down not just teachings, but foundational stones. And now, at the very end of his discourse, he paused his teaching and told a story. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. He paints the picture slowly and deliberately. 2 men, 2 houses, 2 foundations. From the outside, especially while the sun was shining brightly, the 2 houses would likely have looked identical. Same walls, same roof, same windows. If you had walked past them on a bright afternoon, you wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. And that, precisely, is the critical point. The difference was entirely invisible. The profound difference lay hidden underneath. Then Jesus highlighted the single, crucial factor that set them apart. Both men heard the exact same words. The same words. The wise man and the foolish man stood side by side, with the same access to the teaching, the same intelligence, the same opportunity to hear that carpenter speak on the hillside that day. They heard precisely the same sermon. The wise man heard it and built his life upon it. The foolish man heard it and merely admired it. That, in essence, is the entire gap. And it is a gap most of us inhabit for the majority of our lives. What does it truly mean to build on the rock? Jesus answers this question immediately, in the very same breath. Hearing these words of mine and putting them into practice. It's not about merely studying them or posting them as platitudes. It's about doing them. It means living them out in every ordinary day until they have quietly, yet thoroughly, reshaped the life you actually live. It means the Beatitudes are not just concepts, but are actually lived. Enemy love is not just an idea, but is actually practiced. Secret generosity is not just contemplated, but actually given away. The Lord's Prayer is prayed honestly, all the way through, with the line about forgiveness actually meant and internalized. It means pulling the plank from your own eye before you dare reach for anyone else's speck. It means seeking the kingdom of God first thing in the morning, exactly as He commanded. Then, there is the other foundation. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the foundation Jesus describes for the foolish man is the most ordinary, deceptively simple thing in the world: sand. It looks perfectly solid and reliable in the right light. It's incredibly convenient. It demands no arduous digging whatsoever. You can erect a beautiful house on sand in half the time and with a mere fraction of the effort, which is precisely why people are so tempted to build on it. The most dangerous foundations are often the ones that appear utterly reliable, until the day they catastrophically fail. What might sand look like for someone hearing this today? It could be building your life on external achievement, only to realize one day that even after the promotion, the perfect house, and widespread respect, you still feel perpetually a step behind. It could be building on the approval of others, watching your inner peace rise and fall with every new message, every passing comment, or every moment of silence. Or it could be building on comfort, only to discover how utterly fragile your faith feels the moment life inevitably stops being easy. Or, most simply, it could be building on the complacent assumption that the storm will never come at all. The storm, Jesus does not describe it in excruciating detail. He doesn't need to. He leaves it almost generic on purpose. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew. Whatever your personal storm may be, you can easily place it inside that evocative sentence. Illness, betrayal, profound grief, crushing failure, the sudden collapse of something around which you had built your entire identity, the terrifying night the phone call came that irrevocably changed everything. Think back to your own last truly devastating storm. What held firm? What gave way instantly the moment the wind hit it? At the very end of this parable, Jesus guides the listener back to where he began, the same hillside where a carpenter had sat down to teach. But now, after everything he has so profoundly said, you finally grasp what he was doing from his very first word. He was not merely delivering a moral code, a list of do's and don'ts. He was meticulously laying a foundation. Every single word, from blessed are the poor in spirit, all the way to the wise man built on rock, was a stone. He was handing them out one by one to anyone willing to take them and build a life that would endure. A storm might feel as though it is solely about your external circumstances, but every trial in this life ultimately reveals what your life is truly resting upon. And beyond every storm we face in this life, Jesus' solemn warning reaches toward that final, ultimate moment when every life and every foundation will stand completely exposed before God. By the time that final rain falls, it is far too late to begin digging. When Jesus finished speaking, the crowd simply sat there, stunned into silence. Matthew tells us they were utterly amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had inherent authority, utterly unlike their familiar teachers of the law. Then, slowly, they began to rise and walk back down the hill. They had ascended that hill with 3 distinct voices ringing loudly in their ears. But by the time the carpenter ceased speaking, every single one of those powerful, ingrained voices had been unequivocally answered. To the Pharisee, who meticulously measured holiness in public displays and visible inches, he had revealed a profound righteousness that resides in the hidden parts of you that no one else ever sees. To the zealot, who was perhaps sharpening a blade for an enemy, he had offered the infinitely harder weapon of loving that enemy and praying for them. And to Rome, with its ancient, brutal gospel that the strong eat and the weak serve, he had promised the earth, not to the powerful, but to the meek. These were 3 dominant voices that had owned that hillside, influencing generations. Yet, in a single afternoon, a humble carpenter sitting in the dirt had meticulously taken apart all 3. And every single person in that crowd carried the same words down that mountainside. The same beatitudes, the same urgent call to be salt and light, the same Lord's Prayer, the same parable of the 2 builders, the same warning of a coming storm. Some of them were profoundly changed. Many of them, regrettably, were not. The sermon itself had been identical for all of them. What ultimately set them apart was strikingly simple. It all came down to what each person chose to do with those words once they returned home. And that is what makes it so profoundly unsettling. That hillside keeps coming back. Every time someone honestly encounters what Jesus set up there, the scene reassembles itself around them. The crowd, the carpenter sitting down to teach, and the listener who now has to decide whether they will carry these words back into their life as something they merely admired, or as something they wholeheartedly intend to live. You have just listened to the Sermon on the Mount unfolded precisely the way the first crowd heard it. Now, the only question left is the very one Jesus left the crowd with. What are you going to build with today? Not the rest of your life. Not someday far in the future. But today. Perhaps it's that difficult conversation you've been avoiding. The one where enemy love stops being an abstract concept and starts being a courageous phone call. Perhaps it's a prayer you've been reciting for years, now prayed honestly for the very first time, all the way through, with the forgiveness line truly spoken and deeply meant. Perhaps it's a quiet moment of generosity that no one will ever know about, given so discreetly that even your own left hand barely notices. Perhaps it's a worry finally named out loud and surrendered, instead of being endlessly rehearsed in your head one more time tonight. These are small stones. These are the kinds of small, deliberate stones a life is actually built from, because the storm is coming. Every life, without exception, will eventually encounter weather it did not choose. And when it does, the only thing that will truly matter is what your house was standing on. The small surrenders, the unseen generosity, the prayers offered without an audience, the forgiveness freely given before it was ever deserved. Close your eyes for just a moment and transport yourself back to that hillside. Feel the dust, sense the crowd around you. See the carpenter sitting in front of you, looking at you with the same profound gaze he held for them. And imagine that everything he just said, he said specifically for you. Because he did. Build, friend. While there is still light, while the sky is still clear, while the choice is still undeniably in your hands, build.